All right. Well, welcome everyone. Glad y'all are here.
Part C.
Some of you may recall that a number of months ago, I sort of put forward the idea that we could put together an advocacy team that would deal with the kinds of issues that arise and we see in the newspapers. And that team sort of assembled. We'll talk about that in a little while, and has been doing a variety of things. But we thought that we've got this this nice couple of weeks before Pentecost, and we could talk about what advocacy is and isn't, how it's different from some other things, and where the Episcopal Church works in all of those areas. And so that's what we're going to do. And I thought, well, we'll talk about it as Bible in the News, kind of bridging the gap. And I set it up. It occurred to me that really the question of advocacy grows out of our baptismal covenant. And at the end of our renewal of our baptismal vows, are these two questions that we all sort of raise our hands and say yes. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And the answer, I will, with God's help. And then this other one, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? I will, with God's help. So those two promises that we make at our baptism and then reaffirm every time we attend a baptism and have this this back and forth with the celebrant. This is really who we are. It's as much as who we are as going to church or praying or repenting and returning to the Lord. These are all, there is no hierarchy here. They are all equal as to what we make our commitments to. So when I thought about these two, as we were talking about Good Shepherd and our why and all of those kinds of things, it occurred to me that will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? This is really an outgrowth of that passage from Matthew, right? Where Matthew tells the story about, or Jesus tells the story about, when I was in prison, you came and visited me, and when I was hungry, you clothed me, or when I was in prison and you didn't visit me, and all those kinds of things. This is where that promise grows out of that thing from Jesus, and we tend to think about it, in what I would call outreach terms, giving clothing, visiting in the prison, giving water to the thirsty, all of those kinds of things. Good Shepherd does that really, really well. Our outreach committee and outreach team, we collect clothing. We serve at St. Clare's. We serve at St. Francis. We do all of these things really well, where we serve Christ in all persons, loving neighbor as ourselves. This I see as Good Shepherds, one of our strengths, and other people do as well, that we are an outreach focused congregation. But there's also this other side of striving for justice and peace and respecting the dignity of every human being that is equally important as seeking and serving Christ. And it seemed to me that this was kind of the advocacy side of who we are as Christians. There's the charity side and the advocacy side. As I was driving in this morning, I was listening to an interview with somebody who was talking about the environmental impact of trail running. Now, here you go. You're not going to hear that very often on a Sunday morning, right? And she was saying, yeah, there's a lot that we can do to make an impact, but if she said if I stopped doing something, if I died, the impact on the carbon footprint would be nil, because I don't make very much of an impact. But if I can influence a corporation to make some changes, then that impact is magnified. And so she didn't discount doing things that would decrease her own carbon footprint, but she was talking about the other kinds of impact that you can have outside of your own sort of direct action. And so this is where I understand sort of advocacy comes in. And it's different than politics, although it can have relation to that. But it's so that's where this conversation arises this morning. And so what I'd like to do now, in talking with the team, we talked about how to do this. What I'd like to do is show a video that is an interview between Canon Alex, our Canon to the Ordinary. He, over the course of the year that we've been in COVID land, he's done a series of what he calls the Canon Conversations, and he's talked with a lot of different people about all sorts of things. But he had a conversation a while back with, I'll let Alan Yarborough introduce himself. This is a 12 to 15 minute conversation about questions of advocacy and the Episcopal Church specifically.
Hi, this is Alex Dyer. I'm back this year, 2021, with continuing our Canon Conversations. And I'm here with Alan, and Alan, I'll allow you to introduce yourself.
Sure, it's good to be with you. I'm Alan Yarborough with the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. I'm the Church Relations Officer there, so primarily help equip Episcopalians in federal policy advocacy, doing trainings and workshops and social media and all sorts of forms of engagement around that.
Thanks, Al. And can you talk a little bit, for those who are not familiar with the Office of Government Relations, what it does, how it's connected to the Episcopal Church?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a formal part of the Episcopal Church since the late 70s was the first version of the office, but it's part of the church-wide staff, or the presiding bishop staff, which is based in New York, although we're physically located in DC. And our task is to represent the Episcopal Church's policy positions to the U.S. government, the U.S. federal government. And then we also are tasked with equipping Episcopalians and joining us in that advocacy and sort of organizing our efforts there.
There's something I've, gotten a lot of notices from EPPN. So we love our acronyms here in the Episcopal Church. Can you tell us what EPPN stands for and what it does?
Sure. I know it's I have to be bilingual in church acronyms and U.S. government acronyms. So it's a fun place to be. But the EPPN is the Episcopal Public Policy Network, which is run from our office, but is sort of our primary means of engaging the church, at the grassroots level, connecting Episcopalians across the church to their elected officials in DC, and all of the sort of calls to action, all of the advocacy that we send out through the EPPN is based in church policies that come from General Convention and Executive Council. So it's not something that our office comes up with. We are the bicameral legislature of the Episcopal Church. Deliberates and votes on what eventually becomes church policies that we represent.
Yeah, it's great. So it's not just you all, what you're passionate about, even what the presiding bishop's passionate about. It's
correct.
It comes from General Convention, which, I'm sure there's Episcopalians out there who agree with those, and those who don't. We're a wide, diverse denomination, and I know here we are a very wide and diverse state when it comes to political opinion here in Colorado. But so there's a lot going on now in DC. As a used to work in DC, and it just I hardly recognize it anymore with what's going on. At least what I see here in Colorado on the TV screens. We're just a week from the Capitol being invaded and everything, all the things that went on there. As we speak, there's an impeachment resolution on the House being discussed. So where are Episcopalians or followers of Jesus, followers of the way of love? Where are we in all this? What should we do? Should we be quiet? Should we, voice our opinions? How do we act? What are you suggesting?
There are a number of ways, I think, to approach this moment, because I think even without the events of the past week and sort of the overlay of extreme and unique events that have been happening, any transition into a new Congress, into a new presidential administration usually means a lot of work. And so the first answer that comes to mind, to that question for me is very specific to our office and what we're doing. And I don't mean that as a dodge of perhaps of the question and a different way to answer it, but really it's looking at that transition and recognizing that with any new session of Congress, with any new start to a new presidential administration, it's always one of the most active and quote unquote productive times for legislative change. Members of Congress are they're more willing to take votes. Of course, we're seeing party change and in terms of the composition in Congress as well as the presidency, which creates a very different landscape for legislation. And so these next sort of the marketing is the next 100 days, but roughly the first half year of this current Congress and new presidential administration that will begin on the 20th requires a lot of focus and attention on a lot of the issues that Episcopalians care about. And so we're really trying to direct both the efforts of our office and inspire Episcopalians to keep that in mind and to keep speaking out about legislative priorities, which through church leadership, we've outlined as creation care, racial justice, ending poverty, which has domestic and international components, immigration and refugees, and human rights and peace building. So that's one answer to that question. To perhaps more to the events themselves. I think there are any number of layers to peel back in terms of our own personal opportunities to engage. One of, I think, the more fundamental ones, and perhaps one that comes from our office as well, is to engage in dialogue with one another across difference. And that's political difference, that's difference in experience, that's difference in identity. And we have our civil discourse curriculum, Make Me an Instrument of Peace, that we have done in collaboration with Church Next and Forward Movement. That's been out for a while, but we will continue to promote that and encourage people to take that to hopefully prevent us from getting worse in our divisions and from returning to some of the actions that we have seen this week and in the past 4 to 8 years, really. In terms of the direct moment and accountability, I mean, the presiding bishop has spoken out together with a lot of members of the NCC, National Council of Churches, with other faith groups regarding accountability for President Trump, for other elected officials, and for those who were involved more directly and in person with the insurrection at the Capitol. And so we're hoping to see, justice there, things to move through proper channels and for accountability to take place.
What I appreciate is the presiding bishop's statement afterwards. It was actually used. We do a weekly sermon that the bishop normally does, but she did an intro to it and let Bishop Curry have the virtual pulpit for the Sunday, if you will. And it's really centered in love and the Christian message. And I think, we get confused sometimes with that. We want to kind of put who we are as a citizen and who we are as a follower of Jesus. Not that they're mutually exclusive. Hopefully, being a follower of Jesus drives your actions as a citizen. But there's a little bit of kind of this distinction between the two. And I really like that, he called us back to being kind of followers of Jesus and the way of love, and really framed things up really great. So I commend that to anybody who has not seen it. Yeah. So, along this, we see incredible division partisanship now in the United States, especially kind of in DC, and people are kind of getting into their camps. And I appreciate you raising up that curriculum. But what do you say to conservatives or identifies as maybe if they're Republicans or just conservatives that are not Republicans? And is there a place for them in the Episcopal Church?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I hear that question. Is there somewhat often? Is there a place for conservatives here? And not really a question. Is there a place for liberals here? Doesn't necessarily come up as much, but over the years, the Episcopal Church has been, I think, criticized as the Republican Party of prayer or the Democratic Party of prayer, kind of depending on which way the wind's blowing to an extent. But ultimately, what we hope to promote, from our office and through political engagement as the churchwide staff, is just a recognition that we are in this together. We are in our communities together. We can serve in relationship with our government, both as an institution, as individuals, to approach some of the challenges that our communities are facing. It's not exclusively about, wagging our finger, vote yes, vote no on a certain bill, although that certainly is part of it. But it is really about more holistic relationship building and problem solving. And so we need diversity of ideas. We need diversity of perspectives across the political spectrum, across identities, across experiences. And, I also, in terms of our conservatives welcome here or liberals, it is not my expectation, it's not our office's expectation, you alluded to this, that every Episcopalian is going to agree 100% with every policy position that we have. We have resolutions going back for decades on dozens and dozens of issues, and I think it's unreasonable for someone of either political party to agree with all of them. But what we hope at the core is that people see, they feel a spark of energy in being involved in this type of work, that they feel turned on by it, or motivated by it to speak out to their elected officials, to hold them accountable, to engage in conversations in their communities on these topics, because they're not just going to solve themselves. And I don't think we can wait for others to solve them for us. We've got to step forward and do that engagement on our own. If you can only find that around veterans healthcare or immigration or anti-poverty work and homelessness, that is okay. But, as the Episcopal Church, we feel like we do need to speak out on all of these things. And we also recognize there are Episcopalians that care about each of these things out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have policy on them.
Yeah. And I think the challenge is we live in these times, we feel like we have to agree with everything, like with people that we're around or whatever too. And, I think the Episcopal Church at its best is a place where we can hold differing opinions and be kind of a wide tent for people to hold that and still gather together to be followers of Jesus. And it's manifested itself in different ways. So I'm sure you probably get this question a lot too. There's many people out there who say, well, the church shouldn't be political. I go to church, I don't want to hear anything about politics. I just want to feel good. I don't, want that stuff from the week to come into my Sundays. How do you respond to people who say that?
There's, I can be a snarky person at times. And it's one of the more snarky responses is, well, the gospel is political. So of course Sunday is going to be political. But I don't know if that's sufficient enough to really get at, I think, the concern and hesitancy that people have. I think a lot of folks who are skeptical of this work, they think of political as being partisan, that we are here to support the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or that we only hold Republican administrations accountable, but not Democratic administrations accountable when they're in office. It really is about representing the values of the Episcopal Church in the public square. It's about recognizing the need as public as an organization to engage with our elected officials in problem solving, which I mentioned before. You know, and to really lean into politics as being this engagement in our community to problem solve, which I think is I mean, Jesus's ministry is steeped in that. Yes, there's individual responsibility and accountability. Yes, there's the role of the church as an institution, having outreach ministries, but there is also speaking truth to power. There is also working with government officials. All of this is political in a broader sense, and goes, I don't even like to say beyond the partisan. It's different than partisan. The partisan work is not something that we are involved in. It's not something that we're encouraging people to be involved in, although we recognize folks are. Episcopalians run for office all the time. We're still overrepresented in Congress, even though the number of Episcopalians in Congress is lower than it's been in history. You know, but our work, political work, is about tackling those problems in community with one another.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate you drawing the distinction between partisanship and political, because that's been my experience. People are unfortunately using those words interchangeably, and they're quite different things. So yeah. Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing on behalf of the Episcopal Church. We appreciate it, and we hope and pray for a peaceful transfer of power, and then we can get back to this country, to some of the values that we value, and most importantly, that we can be loving followers of Jesus. So thanks, Alan.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into this question and this Y chart, I'd be interested in your reactions, responses to that Canon Conversation.
Well, I didn't even know this office existed. I found it fascinating. And I think that last point, what's the difference between being political and partisan? That's a very good question. That's something I've got to think a lot about.
I, of course, liked it, but I'm also a 50-year member of the League of Women Voters. And the League operates the very same way. We do not take stands unless they've been thoroughly investigated on all sides. And we certainly are pro dignity, human dignity. So, and we have National League, we have State League, and Arapahoe Douglas County League. And that's the way it's set up throughout the country. So I'm very interested, and I get the newsletter to check out where the Episcopal Church is, because I see the League and the Episcopal Church being able to work together on pieces of legislation that fit both of our positions when it comes to that piece of legislation. So I enjoyed it a great deal. I like it. And I was sitting here taking notes, and maybe someone wants to respond to this. The word conservative is not being used as a person who wants limited government. It's being used these days for a person who wants to support voter fraud. And I'm just absolutely confused by this. So if we have someone who sees him or herself as a conservative, how are you defining the word these days?
How do you
That's a good question. I don't know if somebody wants to jump in there, but it might take us a little bit far afield from what we want to do today, but it's certainly a worthy question. I mean, the same thing could be asked about those who are who might consider themselves liberal, but let's hold that.
Part of the problem with both of those terms is they are defined by the opposing group. And I believe that part of the liberation movements that began in the last century one of the things was you get to define yourself, you get to name yourself. But the problem with names is what happens when a name becomes loaded with burdens from opinions not yours. And how do you redeem, reclaim, or move on to a new name is hard. So I don't know what a conservative would call, how they would define that term at this point. And I know many people who consider themselves liberal don't wish to use that term any longer because it's been laden with meaning that they don't believe in.
Susan, well said. And I also think that, there are many people who are hybrids, conservative this area, liberal in that area. And, it has come to be such a split that, people think it's an all or nothing thing. And yet there's a whole lot of gray area in the middle that just being independent doesn't necessarily solve that issue.
I think that one of the things that Alan, as opposed to Alex, Alan brought up pretty well, actually they both did, is where do these categories that we like to put people in, where do they intersect with being a follower of Jesus? And we jump to judgment really quickly using those categories rather than sort of saying, as I mentioned in my sermon, that the whole point is Jesus is the authority, and Jesus says do this. So how do we relate what Jesus says to these categories that aren't, we can, well, you understand what I mean? It's these other terms of liberal and conservative, those aren't necessarily Jesus terms. And what does that mean?
Well, and I think that Elaine is right. The vast majority of Americans are moderates. And they swing one way or another off the middle, depending upon issues. I think that's the place where most Americans are. And I know that my response to one of my doctors, who's a devout Roman Catholic, but it was on the Affordable Care Act, and he asked me a question. I said, you need to know, Dr. Bob, that first and foremost, I'm a Christian. Before anything else, I'm a Christian. And he said, okay, that satisfies that argument. And I think we need to be free enough and unintimidated to make that statement. I'm a Christian, and I try to follow the teachings of Jesus. And so that's where I am on this issue.
So that becomes kind of a good segue into the question that's on the slide here. How does this conversation, the conversation that Alan and Alex had, and sort of the discussion we're having here, how does this reflect our baptismal covenant personally? What does it mean to be a Christian in terms of how you understood it, Irma, and how Dr. Bob understood it, because he saw that as a conversation ender, right? How do we, how does this reflect our baptismal covenant personally or as a community? As we put together in this Y circle, where you can see the striving for justice is down there in the lower sort of right-hand quadrant, or whatever it is when it's not 4 but 6. So
Father, what comes to mind when you reflect on those questions is it's easy to do because we're all white. And so we talk in that world, and it doesn't reflect the total expanse of the United States. And so about 30% of the time we're doing what those questions say. Do we believe in this equality and stuff? But we're not practicing it. And I think the coronavirus really showed that in that deaths among African Americans was double their percentage, and about almost double their percentage if you were Hispanic. And yet our faith says we're not supposed to allow that to happen. And so we as Christians go, well, that's fine. It's okay. It's not affecting me. But as a society, it is. In the last recession we had, which was almost a depression, $84 billion of real estate was taken from the African Americans.
Yes.
Nobody went to jail. So we tolerate this kind of living white and saying the rest of you got to catch up with us. And it's really hard for me to live my faith and see that. And I wish Bishop Curry was more John the Baptist like, with a little more zealot and anger that this is not allowed and that this is wrong. This is not what my faith's about. I truly believe that he believes that. I just don't see those messages coming often enough.
I think part of that for me, though, is we tend to get information about what the world is like as we grow up, as we become adults, from the people who are around us who are like us. And that's one reason why we gravitate toward groups, places to live, bodies to be with, that reflect what we know and understand. And for many of us, some of the recent events have been eye-opening about justice issues, and also the impact of lack of justice on peace. And so I think part of what you're talking about is, how do we become less ignorant about people who also share this world with us, who are not us, or whatever the group of us is. And I think many people now wish to see beyond their narrower places and seek lots of different places to find those viewpoints, some of which seem to me to be based in factual circumstances, and some of which seem to be based in fantasy to me.
That's well said, Susan. Last week, the New York Times had a great article on titled, "Do You Live in a Bubble?" And part of that was a interactive database. You enter your zip code and it shows you around you, 500 homes, what is the percent that are Republican versus Democrat. And they're trying to get at the answer of, why is it that over half of the Republicans still believe the big lie that the whole election was a fraud? Well, it's because the people around you all believe that. So they're all scratching their head like, how did Biden win? Everybody is voting for Trump.
Did the article include independents? That's the largest party, quote unquote, in Colorado today.
Yeah, they had, well, they called them moderates. Yeah.
Okay, because I have appreciated Jason Crow and his stand on things, so enough said for that. But he brought up that he is in a district that is majority is independent. And one of the things with the big lie is, how many independents are you going to get with that? Because the polling shows that the vast majority of Americans aren't there. So how are you going to get it? And I think well, see, this is kind of the bubble, but it's hard to believe that Colorado, which has, very efficient voting processes, we're not stopping anybody from voting, and we had no weird ballots this time across the entire state. But we got a representative elected on the Western Slope who does believe the big lie. And I'm going, well, why? You got elected. It's like, why? I don't understand the lack of connection, except for the fact we don't want people of certain colors or certain economic groups to vote, because they'll vote the wrong way. And so if we make it difficult for people to vote, then we won't get, the votes we don't want. To me, it's just absolutely ludicrous, but that's me. I don't know. I think that Susan's point about justice, I also think was very good. And we certainly are dealing with justice. I am pleased to see that Congress through the efforts of, I think it's Tim Scott, the Republican senator, working with Democrats, we may have a piece of legislation to take to the president. They may get it through. And I find that very helpful, and I find it very good. I think all police departments are very aware of, don't do anything because you think that a person is guilty because of the color of their skin. I tend and have tended my life to be a speeder. I'm very bad. I don't get a lot of tickets, but I've had some. And I've never been asked to leave my car, ever. I don't understand that kind of mentality for somebody who's the wrong color skin. That needs to stop with that kind of an issue. But on the other hand, the other side of the story is, you got to take care of what the court is saying you got to do, and then there won't be any warrant out for your arrest that you could be taken into jail for. So I was given this great piece of advice as a young teenager from a woman in my family who said there's always three sides, or your side, your brother's side, and the right side. And I've used that, looking at all sides, and the middle is the side that doesn't have a vested interest. So I want us to be just, but I also understand when things happen that we don't like to have happen, but the situation wasn't expected. I don't expect a 13-year-old out on the streets, but my daughter told me, Mother, I snuck out of the house a lot, so I have to accept that happens. And you know, I just don't expect it. I don't think that's there, but I'm learning to expect a lot. So anyway, I think there's hope there.
I would like to say I did an internship at the Arapahoe County Courthouse on Potomac, and in the criminal court. And for people who don't have easy access to transportation, and even those who do, if you have a court date and go to court, it can take half a day to be there to have your case considered. Even if you got an appointment at the very beginning of the day, because judges do not have to take cases in order. And depending on the needs of the lawyers and a lot of other situations, it can cost people in jobs that are marginal type jobs a lot of money to go to court. And that's part of what when we talk about the unequal justice in our world, those of us who can take time off from work with personal time or whatever, have a very different life than people who could lose money, and not just money, perhaps an entire job, by going to court. I wonder now, given the ease of Zoom meetings, why most of our court business, especially initial arraignments and stuff, cannot just happen through Zoom, but that's not how it's done right now. And I've seen people get very upset where people with mental health issues get warrants a lot because they just don't follow what should be done. So it's a complicated thing how our justice system works, and understanding all of the multiple impacts where it's true. Why don't you show up at court? For many of us, that's not that hard a thing to do. For some people, it costs them a tremendous amount for something where they didn't necessarily do anything wrong. Even proving that you didn't do something wrong, just having to show up at court has a cost.
And that's valuable. That's valuable.
I'm going to break in here just because it's 4 minutes to 11. which is great. We've got 2 weeks to talk about this. But what I'm going to, I'm going to show you the questions that we were going to discuss, but we don't have time, clearly. The video sort of took, I mean, it really set the stage, I think, in a really good way for furthering this conversation. These are the questions that we were going to sort of engage in some more discussion. But what I'd like to suggest is, and I see Sally taking a picture of it. I'll post these questions in the e-news. What I'd like to suggest is that we come back next week. I didn't know where this was going to break, right? So that we come back next week thinking about these. You know, what is Good Shepherd doing, or what might be called? Is this something that? How do we engage individuals in the congregation? I think one of the things that probably many of you have heard, but I've heard as well, is that there is this hesitancy that Alan spoke to a number of times about, well, we don't want to engage in politics. You know, how do we see that kind of attitude keeping people in this congregation from engaging in advocacy, which is different? Or there may be some overlap. So I'm just going to suggest that we take a look at these questions. Again, I'll put them out in the e-news, so you'll see them at least on Thursday. And to ask, where is Good Shepherd in all of this? And then next week too, we'll come back and we can talk about some of the things that Alan mentioned about where the Episcopal Church stands, or where its areas of emphasis are, coming out of General Convention and General Executive Council. But then where are the areas that the diocese, or what are the areas that the diocese has said, these are our areas of concern in terms of living out our baptismal covenant? And are there some of these that really resonate more than others with individuals or with the congregation as a whole? I don't see us saying, well, this is our issue. That's not going to work, because it's not going to be everybody's. But there may be some that make more sense for us to think about and maybe programming about. I don't know. So I see this as the beginning of a conversation. I'm really, really grateful for everybody's passion and for your interest to just be a part of this. But I'm going to suggest that we pray on this a little bit more. We do have a number of folks who are on the advocacy team. The only 3 of us that are here today, because I know some people are traveling, are Deb and Sandy and I. But Mary Need is, I think she's traveling. Marianne Panarelli is traveling. Candace Moon is on this as well. So there are a number of us here. We'd love to have more people engaged, but it's not just a committee's work like the outreach committee. It's funneling information and funneling opportunities for people to engage. And so that's kind of what this morning was all about, and what maybe next week can take us a little bit further into. But I don't know, does anybody have any final thoughts or questions before I sort of close us off, because I have to go get ready for another service?
I was just going to let everybody know that the Arapahoe Douglas League is having a meeting on Tuesday evening about our Dying with Dignity legislation and how is it working in Colorado. And it's on Zoom, and I can send that maybe to you, Father Gary, and you can get it out if you want to. I never quite know what the rules are, but it's going to be. That's
one of the things we'll try and address. Susan,
Okay.
were you?
No, Sandy, I think, had something to say.
Sandy.
No, not me.
Oh,
I
sorry.
was trying to say that it might be useful for us to think about a little bit of a difference between what is outreach and what is advocacy, and how the two work together. For example, we know that there are people going hungry in this area. They're at Covenant Cupboard, and they are our neighbors. Why are people going hungry is an advocacy question. How do we feed people is an outreach question.
Yeah.
And I think we do a lot of we're comfortable doing the outreach stuff. We're comfortable donating furniture to a family that's been evicted. But the advocacy piece is, how is a family being evicted in a time when there are prohibitions on eviction? And where is the justice system in terms of evictions? That's an advocacy issue. So we skirt advocacy a lot at Good Shepherd, maybe thinking about the things that really mean a lot to us: food, housing, hunger, and social justice, and care of our creation. How do we make an impact
Shut
in
up.
areas out of faith?
Good. Lots to think about.